Alright, so for Lesson 3, we're turning our focus to mythology, and like the first two lessons, there'll be a second part to the lecture where we discuss writing a literature review, which is the third component I'm asking you to include in your first essay, which will be due after Lesson 5. So this lesson, like the first two, will be a little bit longer than the majority of them, but still a little bit shorter than the first two. Mythology, like I mentioned before, is the oldest form of literary genre alongside poetry, because most mythology was written in verse form, so the two go hand in hand. In many different countries have mythologies. The most well-known ones are obviously the Greek and Roman myths that we'll talk about a little bit. Also, Indian mythology was very important, influential, interesting. Other countries have their mythologies too, but these are the most well-known ones going back the furthest, is why we're covering them now. So, ancient mythology usually took the form of epic poems. An epic poem is a very long poem. If you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Aeneid or Gilgamesh before, you know what I'm talking about. And it usually focuses on a main protagonist. There's a wide array of characters, but there's a central figure, typically male. That's the heroic figure. Often not an ideal hero in terms of what we would think of, usually very prideful. Goes on some kind of journey or some kind of experience where typically not always they learn something because they face many challenges. Epics were also very representative of the culture they came from. They were typically told aloud, again, because the majority of the population in most countries couldn't read until thousands of years after this, and so they were a form of entertainment, and in that sense they would reflect the values, the beliefs of the culture they came from, typically. As I said, the Aeneid from Rome and then the Iliad and the Odyssey from Greece are probably the two most famous, and Gilgamesh is from Mesopotamia, and that's the oldest piece of literature we know. The Ramayanas, not as well known in Western literature because it comes from Eastern literature from India, but I find it to be a very fascinating, interesting, epic poem that not as many people has heard of before. So next time we're going to look at a couple chapters from the Iliad and the Ramayana to give us a good overview of the epic and of mythology as two literary forms. Today I want to cover more just the basics of mythology, and both those texts, the Iliad and the Ramayana, really relate to our themes from the course concerning fear and nationalism. So that's how we're going to break into those themes finally with the next lesson when we talk about those two works. Plays also are considered part of mythology. Certain plays are. We're going to talk about drama in the second unit. Drama is also an older literary form because it's performed, so you do not need to be able to read to see drama unfold. It doesn't, I'm not sure why, it doesn't date as far back as poetry and the epic, and that's probably because it took some centuries for people to get organized and start, attending these things together. But in ancient Greece, you have Sophocles, who wrote Oedipus and Antigone. When you think of, you go out into the general public, people probably know names like Achilles and Odysseus, and they'd probably put Oedipus in that same category. If they hadn't thoroughly studied literature, might not know that Oedipus is actually from a play and is more of a tragic hero than an epic hero. But still, for that reason, that's the way people typically think of it. That's because Oedipus has become part of mythology, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. You also have Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is what we're looking at today, which, like the Aeneid, is from ancient Rome. And it's a little bit different. It's technically classified by most scholars as an epic, but rather than being the tale of a hero who goes on a journey and because of his pride learns something and reflects the culture, it's a collection of little vignettes or little stories. I think, 250 myths. Our excerpt today has 3 of the first 4. I left out the middle one there because it's not quite as interesting and rather long. And so, a lot of people compare epics to novels. even though they're written in verse form, because they're long stories that tell of events and have a narrative and have protagonists. And if we're following that comparison, then Metamorphosis is really like a collection of short stories. So that's how it's a little bit different from the other epics, even though a lot of people classify it as an epic. The reason why we're looking at it today for our first lesson on mythology is coming up in just a minute. You do have later epics that aren't necessarily considered part of mythology, or if they are, not as far back. Some examples would be Beowulf, although that's debated if it's an epic or not, so that's something we can discuss in a couple lessons. Dante's The Divine Comedy, which you probably heard of Dante's Inferno. That's the first book. He did the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso, and those are the three parts of the Divine Comedy. Milton's Paradise Lost. And then there's a really great poem. It's an epic poem. It's about 300 pages long, but still reads fairly quickly, called Omeros or Omeros, depending on your preference of how to pronounce it, by Derek Walcott, who's a post-colonial author, and we'll talk about post-colonialism later in the semester, but it's very interesting. He'd written a lot of short poems, and then he wrote this and won the Nobel Prize. They're like, all right, you wrote an epic poem in the 1980s. We'll go ahead and give you a Nobel for that, Walcott. So the epic hasn't died out completely, but after, the birth of Christ, the last 20,000 years, it hasn't been around as much as it was before that, as it was during these ancient empires, the ancient polytheistic empires. So the reasons for that vary. Certainly people becoming more literate. Also, we'll talk about the gods and their relationships to the people, and I think as these parts of the world started to become Christian rather than polytheistic, the style of the epic was appreciated less. So the conversion to Christianity, and then eventually, thousands of years later, rising literacy rates contributed to the decline of the epic, although it certainly still shows up every now and then. Mythology is very influential, which is what we're going to talk about with Metamorphosis in a minute. So a lot of authors have done variations on it. They've written novels or short poems that retell the stories. In many ways, Alcott's Omeros, even though it's written in verse form and it's long, does do this because he's from the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean, and speaks a dialect, a Creole dialect, and that's his rendering of Homer's name, which had never been rendered before in that dialect of Omeros. Homer's the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so he's kind of retelling it in his own epic that deals with his people and what they experienced after colonization. You also have, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Alfred Tennyson, a Victorian poet, writing a short poem called Ulysses, and then James Joyce, the Irish writer, writing what many consider to be the most famous novel of the 20th century, which is also called Ulysses in the early 20th century. Ulysses is the Latin name for Odysseus. So what you have there is many of the same characters showing up in Greek and Roman mythology, but the Romans speaking Latin rather than Greek. Odysseus' name in Latin is Ulysses, and Tennyson and Joyce both choosing to use Ulysses, probably because they like the way it sounds better than Odysseus. Tennyson's short poem is set after Odysseus' return to Ithaca at the end of the Odyssey, and speculates on what his life would be like if, he got home and he was no longer going on adventures. And so it's a very old Ulysses or Odysseus wanting to go back out and have one last adventure. And so it's this very kind of romantic, adventurous impulse that was kind of different because Tennyson lived during a time that was very rigid with social rules and whatnot. So it was kind of a rebellious poem, and he used Odysseus or Ulysses in that way. Joyce, the Irish writer, modernist from the 20th century, takes the life of an everyday insurance salesman in Ireland, Leopold Bloom, and tells us a long novel, very difficult to read, goes through the events of the day and compares them to the different books or chapters of the Odyssey. And so he's kind of elevating the everyday experience of the Irish individual by drawing on these mythic tropes. And a lot of writers have done similar things. Those are the two most famous examples. And so these examples, the reason I've spent a few minutes on Tennyson and Joyce is because these examples relate to why we study mythology. This stuff is thousands of years old. Why should we study it? Signifiers is the main reason. Not all of us may be as familiar with the name Ulysses as we are Odysseus, but either way, the titles of those works evoke something. We hear Odysseus, we think of the Odyssey. Even a student of literature, even someone who's not a student of literature may recognize the name, may know what it means, because myths are so famous. They've been around so much, they've circulated in culture so much that they've come to represent things that can't be represented necessarily by something else. Say Achilles' heel, right? The prophecy about Achilles being dipped in the water so that he'd be invincible, but his heel didn't touch it. So if he gets struck in his heel, he would be killed, but he couldn't be killed any other way. That myth that comes from Greek mythology, if you say that's someone's Achilles' heel, that means that's their weakness. That's the one way you can hurt them. And you could certainly say that's their weakness, but there's all different types of weaknesses. So when you say Achilles' heel, that's very, very specific, and it means that this is the only way or the best way you can hurt this person. And so the phrase itself, Achilles' heel, has taken on another meaning, or it means not another meaning from where it originally came from, but it's come to manifest itself as having a specific meaning, even 40,000 years later in the 21st century, that you can't quite use another word or phrase to mean exactly the same thing. And if you look through mythology, you'll find quite a few examples like that. So that's why we study mythology, is because of these signifiers. Phrases, ideas, characters, beliefs, symbols, concepts from mythology that explain things that can't be explained other ways that we still reference today. There's an episode of the television show Star Trek The Next Generation, for any of you Trekkies out there, from the 1990s, where the science fiction show set in the future aboard a starship or a spaceship where they're trying to make peaceful contact with this other race, and they have devices called universal translators, and it's translating some words, because you hear some words in English, but other words it's not. They don't know what the problem is. Eventually they realize that this race of aliens speaks entirely in references to mythology. And because they're aliens, it's not the same mythology as Earth, so that's why they're having trouble establishing contact at first. The episode's called Darmok, and the captain of the other ship keeps saying Darmok and Jalad at Tanagar, and the captain of the Enterprise has no idea what he means. It'd be like saying Achilles' heel to mean the one weakness for somebody, or saying Juliet on the balcony to reference love instead of just saying love. So it's a good example of something. Obviously we don't speak that way, but we do some of the time, and that's why mythology is important. Okay, so for the literary text for this lesson, first we're looking at Yeats's Leda and the Swan. And we're looking at Metamorphosis first, but the two are connected, and that's what I'm asking you about in your discussion board question. So Yeats was a modernist writer in the 21st century. He was very similar to Blake. He was very spiritual but anti-traditional religion, and kind of developed his own belief system. He's actually the writer who revived some of Blake's work, and he's an Irish poet, so he comes from that background of that relationship between Ireland and England. The poem Leda and the Swan. I'm sure some of you may have found it disturbing, and you're probably wondering why did he assign something so disturbing so early in the semester? The answer is because it really reflects this topic we were just talking about, with the influence of mythology that's still around today, and the way authors have drawn on mythology and used it in more recent works to convey certain ideas or do certain things that could not be done without the use of mythology. So the story of Leda and the Swan comes from Greek mythology and artwork. So Greek mythology is expansive, way beyond Homer's two epics and Sophocles' two most famous plays, and it encompasses all these different stories. A lot of them are actually collected by Ovid and retold in Latin in the Metamorphosis. And there are other variations, and there's artwork and other places where you find these Greek myths. But one of them is Leda and the Swan. And that's essentially a story where, Zeus takes the form of a swan to rape this woman, Leda. Zeus is the king of the gods. The Greeks believed in multiple gods, and Zeus was their leader, the most powerful god. So he could essentially do whatever he wanted without having to worry about moral ramifications. Jove and Io is the story from Metamorphosis, but it's very similar. It's not exactly a retelling of Leda and the Swan, but it's very similar in that the king of the gods comes down and, through manipulation, assaults a human woman. Jove is the nickname or shorthand name for Jupiter, who is the king of the Roman gods. As I mentioned earlier, we were talking about Odysseus and Ulysses. The Romans inherited their gods and a lot of their founding myths from the Greeks. They came later. They were slightly later empire. They used basically the same gods of the same things. They renamed them, and a lot of them were named after planets. So Jupiter is the Roman name for Zeus, just as Ulysses is the Roman name for Odysseus, and Jove is the shorthand for that. So it's essentially the same god, just in two different cultures, attacking a human woman in slightly different ways, but the stories are very similar. So in order to illustrate how mythology has this pervasive influence that goes well beyond the time it was written and impacts our culture today, I thought I'd use the example of a 20th century writer retelling this story from ancient mythology. So there's a few differences we should note before going forward between the Greek myth and the Jove and Io story. In the Greek myth, I have these two backwards. I should have proofread this PowerPoint better. In the Greek myth, Zeus or Jupiter transforms into a swan to attack Leda. In the Roman myth, Io is transformed into a cow to be protected from Jupiter or Zeus. So flip those two in your mind. But that's an important difference. Might be fruitful to think about. Why change the two? What is the significance of the difference? That could be something to mention in your discussion board post if you come up with an interesting reason as to why. These poems, or excuse me, this short story in the Greek myth, we'll get to the Leda and the Swan in a minute, they show the relationships of gods to people and characterize the gods. So what were gods like in these ancient myths? Very different from, say, a Christian god, if some of you are more familiar with that type of example, but coming down to earth and assaulting a human woman, and there's no ramifications because he's the king of the gods. Even if he weren't the king of the gods, there'd probably still be very few ramifications. It would depend on who the human person was and if there was another god that was connected to them in some way. And so there's a lack of morality here, which again I think is why the epic kind of died out after the Roman Empire became Christian. But it's interesting to see gods characterized this way. That gods aren't necessarily characters you look up to. This is a very interesting part of mythology. So what I'm asking you to do in the discussion board post is to compare Ovid and Yeats. Again, with close reading, look at the language. How are the attacks described? What is the difference in the language? And what does that tell us about the poets or about the culture? Yeats uses very vivid detail. You read that poem and it sounds what it would sound like if a swan were raping a woman, which is why it's horrible and why you may have a visceral reaction and why you may be wondering, why did the professor assign this only in lesson 3 or dropping the class or something? But if you dig in and compare the language and reread both, since they're both very short, I think you'll really see some interesting things, because this horrible thing, rape, one of the most horrific things that can be done to another individual, is described very differently in the two texts. So looking at the language and thinking about that can lead to some interesting ideas. Again, I don't want to go too much into what those ideas are, because I want you to come up with those in the discussion board. And I've probably said too much as it is already. Some of the other things that emerge in the Leda and the Swan poem. Yeats references Agamemnon's death. Agamemnon was the leader of the Greeks, and during the time of the Trojan War, he was the leader of the Greeks. So we'll see him interact with Achilles when we read the Iliad for the next lesson. But the big thing there with Agamemnon is that he gave up his daughter. He sacrificed her to the gods at the start of the Trojan War for the Greeks to do well in the war. And his wife obviously carried a grudge about that. So after the war was over, she eventually murdered him there. So that's one connection when Yeats references Agamemnon's death later in the poem. Also, Helen of Troy, who was originally a Greek, Menelaus' wife, Paris of Troy stole her and brought her to Troy, so the face that launched 1,000 ships. There's a lot of other reasons why the war happened, but that's the one most often cited. She's the daughter of Leda. Helen is born from this attack that Zeus performs on Leda. So by referencing Agamemnon's death, you also Yeats kind of evokes the fall of Troy and the end and the beginning simultaneously is what I would say, because you have the physical depiction of how Helen is conceived. She ignites the war, or what is done to her ignites the war, and then you have the end of the war referenced. And if you read the lines, he's basically saying, can you see the end happening here, the end and the beginning, so to speak. And so I think when you're thinking about the differences between Ovid and Yeats, that's another thing to consider. Is Yeats commenting on mythology here? When why bring Agamemnon into it? Why say you can see the end and the beginning? I think that takes it to another level, adds another layer to this very short poem, and makes it really interesting. What is Yeats saying about mythology? Is he saying mythology is dead? I don't think so, because he references it a lot in his works. What is he saying mythology can do for us in the 20th or 21st century, if we carry his ideas through to today? So that's why there's more going on in this poem than just a brutal attack, as brutal as it is. So think about those references, the beginning and the end, the vivid depiction in Leda and the Swan, and compare that to the very different depiction of essentially the very similar type of attack and Metamorphosis. What are the differences? What does that tell us about these authors and their cultures and their works? And what does that tell us about Yeats and his attitude toward mythology? And what does that eventually tell us in the 21st century? What should our attitude be toward mythology, and what kind of a role does it play in our culture? So I think that's a good introduction to mythology, and that's what I'm looking for you to drive at in your discussion board posts. All right, so we're going to take another 10 minutes or so here and talk about writing a literature review, which is that third component I've asked you to include in your first paper. You know how to develop a topic now. You know how to support it with close reading. You have got to do some research to be able to develop that topic. How do you actually bring the research into the paper? This is how you bring it in. So what is the purpose of a literature review? What is a literature review even? There's two parts to the purpose. Show readers your topic is important, as in other people have written about this topic and their essays have been published, so it matters. Kind of blatant kind of ethos there. And then much more importantly, show readers your specific argument is unique. So if I were to read your paper, assuming I've read nothing else on this topic, how do I know that you're not just repeating what someone else has said? You have to cite the research to show me that. This hopefully should clear up a huge misconception. One thing I often encounter with students when they're first starting out, bringing in secondary sources, the papers, they think the sources are there to support or prove, they say, my argument. But that's not really the case. Because if that were the case, you wouldn't be saying anything unique or original. You'd just be supporting what someone else says. They do support your argument to a certain extent, and they show the topic that your argument is making a claim about is important, but their main purpose is to show how your argument is slightly different or add something new to the conversation that hasn't been said before. So I'm going to use two terms here that I'm using it in a specific way to illustrate a point. In other words, outside of this presentation, the terms would probably be used a little bit differently. So the word topic, I'm using to apply something broad and general. And then the word issue, I'm using to describe something more specific. So your argument is narrow and specific, and topic is broad and general. So topic may be something as wide as gender. And then you have a specific argument about gender and Macbeth. For the example we looked at last time, my essay on Dickens, the big, broad, general topic was representation of animals in Dickens's work. And then I had a narrow, specific argument that was my own argument that I couldn't find any other essay that really made that argument. And that was that the way he portrays animals shows that he embraces Darwinism to a certain extent, or how he portrays humans that are described as animals. So think about what the big topic is. Think about your specific argument. The big topic, there's going to be plenty of people who have written on it, and those are the people you want to cite. The narrow issue, your specific focus, that's something that should be unique only to you. Because if someone else has already written the paper, you don't need to write it again. So you found your sources, let's say, based on the work we talked about last time. You have your topic. Based on your reading of the sources, you feel your topic is unique, or you feel your argument is unique. Excuse me, I shouldn't be confusing the terminology. But that's why outside of this lecture, it has different meanings. So you have a topic, you've done research on the topic, your argument is unique. How do you actually put that research into the paper? We've discussed the why, let's discuss the how. So there's a few things you want to do. State briefly the critical consensus. You may not need to quote from every article, you probably won't have room to. You may not even need to summarize each article, but you want to give the consensus. They're not all saying exactly the same thing, or they wouldn't all be published, but they might agree on a few points, or there might be a general idea that they all pretty much hold, and there's slight variations on it. For instance, with that Dickens topic, all the authors basically concluded he was anti-Darwin, but they gave different reasons as to why, or went into more detail on different aspects of it, so that they each had a unique argument, but the general consensus, you can put an umbrella over the whole thing, is anti-Darwin. So state what that critical consensus is. State how your argument is similar. I don't mean to say you're arguing the same thing, but say this is essentially what you're writing about, right? Most critics it would, in a kind of a crude general way, not refined for a paper, in my example, it would basically be the majority of critics say that Dickens is anti-Darwin. I definitely think Dickens is heavily influenced by Darwin, but he's more pro-Darwin than other people think. So the third and most important thing is to state how your argument is different. Add something new to the conversation. Now, my example I gave, I think, is a decent example. It may be misleading in that I basically disagree with the other critics. Now, that's certainly something you can do, and if you do, obviously your argument is unique. But I don't want you to feel the burden or the pressure to have to be that unique. So it could simply be adding something new. Here's another layer the other critics haven't thought of yet. Or here's something they left out, like they didn't think of this. But it's an important point that if it's included, just enriches the conversation. Think of it like you're at a party, is the metaphor I use. And you walk into a room and you overhear two people talking about something interesting, or a few people talking about it. And you're interested in the topic, so you kind of jump into the conversation en media res, which means in the middle. But you've heard enough that you know you can add something. They haven't said this before. So you say, what about it? Have you thought about this? And then give your point. When you write a literature review, that's essentially what you do. First you map out the conversation, and then you say, hey, wait a minute, have you thought about this? So think about the big topic. This would be kind of like a format for the paragraph if you're writing the paragraph on your essay. So think about the big topic. These critics say these things. Then they're all saying something similar in that. Fill in the blank here, that's the critical consensus. I'm also writing on this topic. I see their point, but... And then that's where you add something to the conversation, or disagree, or point out what they've overlooked, or do something that it doesn't really matter what it is there, as long as it's different enough that it shows how, compared to what you've just listed out, what you're doing is unique and interesting. And that's the purpose of a literature review. I say this, stay there. Alright, so I'm going to give you an example real quick, just to illustrate how to do this, because I think it's something, it sounds like it makes sense, probably after seeing that, and then you go to write the paper, it might not as much anymore when you actually sit down to try to do it. So I'm going to give you an example that hopefully will help. So I also have an essay, again, on Charles Dickens and birds, but it's on his last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which wasn't finished. And this essay was actually recently published in the Victorians Institute Journal, their online journal. So I'm going to show you some examples from that. But it's about, he depicts these, well, he calls them rooks, but they're essentially the same birds as a raven in his novel, and that's what the essay is about. So it's also about the theme of empires. Well, the novel focuses a lot on the British Empire, but my argument is saying something. I'm not going to go into my argument necessarily now because you don't need that information, but it's saying something about how the ravens are used as a symbol of empire, essentially. So there weren't any essays out there when I looked on this novel and ravens, but there were plenty on empire, so I knew that was the place I needed to look. So here's the most recent article I could find, and the critical consensus is contained in these pages. As several recent critics of Edwin Drood have argued, the decaying habitual order represented by the cathedral city and its institutions is in the process of being overwhelmed by the colonial East. So there's that mention of empire, and he gives some examples. And this footnote here is going to list all those other critics I need to mention, that number 6 right after the word East. So then he lists some examples of that. And then you get down to the end here, the paragraph, and he says, whether Dickens admitted or resisted the incursion is a matter of debate, but most recent commentators seem agreed that the customary forms of Cloisterham life, principal among them are the choral service of its venerable cathedral, are under pressure from the colonial margins. So this particular author, Dubois, is writing about the choir in the book. I'm writing about ravens. So two very different things, but they both relate to this bigger topic of empire. So think of big topic, specific focus, big topic, empire, specific focus for him, choir, specific focus for me, ravens. And he says, a lot of critics have mentioned how the city in the book, Cloisterham, is being overwhelmed by imports from the colonial East. And then he says, whether Dickens admitted or resisted this incursion is a matter of debate. So you get all the critics here, and you know they're taking one of two different stands on this topic. So you've got the critical consensus, just like we found it for our mutual friend, again right there. And then he relates it, one of the things that's under pressure from the colonial margins is his topic, cathedral life. So here's the footnote, and you can see all the sources he had. So rather than reading all these people, I was able to look them all up with this footnote and then go through and read the first paragraph of each one and know basically which side of the debate they fell on. But I didn't even necessarily need to mention that in the paper because I have a footnote similar to this in my own paper, which you'll see later. So here's my article, published in the online Victorian Institute Journal. And here's the paragraph where I do my literature review. So here's my literature review if you want to see an example. The constant inflow of colonial goods in Edwin Drood makes the topic of empire a subject that scholars of the novel consistently focus on. And here's my footnote to reference all those same people as Dubois. Then I quote Dubois. He accurately outlines the current state of the critical discussion concerning empire in Edwin Drood when he posits that most recent commentators seem to agree that the customary forms of Cloisterham life are under pressure from the colonial margin. So I have these ellipses here, and I take out the part about the choir. My essay has nothing to do with the choir, so I took that out. but the sentence still makes sense without it, and that's perfectly fine. That's something you can do when you're quoting. And so I quote him because he does such a good job of outlining the critical consensus. I use the quote for that. And then he says there's disagreement over whether the saturation of Cloisterham is reversible or where Dickens desired or intended it to be reversed. So those are the two sides. Can it be reversed? Yes or no. Does Dickens want it to be reversed? Yes or no. The two sides, the two arguments, that's the critical consensus. So Dubois' assessment implies that, and I kind of repeat the same thing here in my own words, that you should always add something after the quote in your own words so that you're not just relying on the quote, that you can only ever use short quotes like I do here and always be able to say the same thing in your own words so that, it really feels like your idea is in a paper, not just a long list of quotes. So I basically restate the same thing and say that, his assessment implies that the conversation boils down to this. And so here, in all these sentences before the however, you have the critical consensus outlined with the appropriate citations for the literature review. And then the final sentence is that thing that shows it's a great literature review, but if I didn't add this final sentence, it would just be a literature review. It wouldn't show the reader how my argument is unique. And then in the final sentence I say, however, I argue that the issue at stake in Edwin Drood is not whether the effects of vast colonial importation can be reversed, but how those effects can be managed. So the conversation is about, there's all these colonial imports coming in. Can we reverse this or just leave them here? And I say, it's not about the kind of binary choice of reversing it or leaving it there. It's how can it be managed? How can these objects be categorized and managed? So I'm saying here, like in the other essay, I basically disagreed with the critics. Here I'm not really disagreeing with them. I'm just saying, hey, what if we thought about it this way? So you have, the literature review, and then you have my statement here that kind of restating my thesis in a way that shows the relationship of it to the literature review. So I just highlighted that for you there. That's the literature review part, and then there's my statement, so you can see that back at the end. So there's my statement about my argument. And then down here I have another paragraph we don't need to look at now, but I basically cite some more of those critics, just kind of showing you that you can still use the critics throughout if you want. You don't have to after the literature review. If it's pertinent, you can, but you want the bulk of the rest to be focused on close reading. But if you want to see kind of how to slip it in a way that doesn't detract from your argument, you can come back to this example. And then here's my footnote. So you can see it's very similar to his. I added a few sources I found through research that he didn't have. Marlene Tromp being one of them, who's someone who actually works for ASU, who's someone I cite in that previous paragraph I just showed you. So you can't necessarily rely entirely on the bibliography of the most recent article. For the purposes of this class, that will be enough. If you wanted to, say, publish one of your papers, you'd have to do more research to make sure that most recent article covered everything. But for the purposes of coming with a topic and doing a literature review for this class, going to the bibliography and the literature review of the most recent article should be enough. And hopefully this is a good example that illustrates that. So hopefully after these 3 lessons you feel very confident in being able to write a literature review, come up with a topic, write a literature review, and defend your argument with close reading. If you have any questions on any of those, especially the topic, please feel free to email me anytime.